Evolution. We all know about it. It's done some wonders. It explains why we look like this instead of this, and why instead of doing things like this, we do things like this. But there was a lot it's helped keep the same. Among these constants is a little something called the fight-or-flight response, which is defined as a physiological reaction that occurs in response to a perceived harmful event, attack, or threat to survival. And it's done a pretty good job of keeping us alive all these years. In fact, at its core, it can be argued that the basis for human response to threats throughout history has been driven by this reaction, as opposed to, say, long-term planning. And it makes sense, given the nature of our brains. However, in the same way that news of an incoming tornado or rising crime levels locally evokes a personal sense of danger, there is one phenomenon that has seemingly bypassed this response, and in some cases, being welcomed. I want to first go over some basic definitions. Because of the way our political discourse is played out, the word liberal has basically lost its meaning. Liberalism is defined as a political and moral philosophy based on the rights of the individual, liberty, consent of the governed, and equality before the law. It is the central principle that our modern forms of democracy are built upon. And by extension, liberal actually means someone who believes in liberalism. Shocker. Liberalism does not mean leftism. Liberalism has nothing to do with libtards. These associations have been ingrained in the public, thanks in large part to some bad faith actors in the media and the highest levels of government. More on this later. In fact, I would wager that most normal people, regardless of party affiliation, would hopefully agree that this definition of liberalism describes a good thing, a proper syntax of governance. Illiberalism is essentially a descriptor for a false democracy. It's a society where elections take place, citizens are, for the most part, free to move around and do as they please, but they have no real inherent political power, and as a result have no real civil liberties. And this opens the door to numerous things, such as tyrannies of the majority, and the fact that whatever liberties that they do enjoy can be taken away without justification at a moment's notice. And as you can probably imagine, these kinds of societies come with all the signature features that you can think of: rigged elections, state-controlled media, the repression of ideas, heinous levels of corruption, and more. Now, it's not that illiberal democracies are the only harmful form of government. All these features and more are commonplace in full-blown authoritarian regimes as well. But in the way that a lot of those authoritarian regimes were born out of a coup or a violent cultural revolution, illiberalism represents a slower, quieter death to democracy. The insidious nature of illiberalism is that it does not evoke a fight-or-flight response like most threats. It doesn't aim to constantly threaten or blanketly purge an entire group of people. It instead aims to deprive people of power in a way that leaves them pretty much unaware, nibbling away at democratic institutions, curtailing certain freedoms here and there, until there is nothing left. It's the gateway drug to authoritarianism. And the thing is, it can be practiced without the majority of the public being bothered, nor even aware that they are living in a false democracy. If this still doesn't seem too bad, here's the pop culture analogy. It's kind of like how people in the Matrix were made to feel content, unaware of the strings on them, yet were utterly deprived of free will. It's also worth noting that the Matrix was designed by the same machines that won a brutal war against the humans. And if you're still wondering whether living in the Matrix would really be all that bad, then I highly recommend an in-depth paper on this very topic by Jim Pryor, a philosophy professor at the University of North Carolina. Furthermore, in an illiberal society, those who ask questions or speak out about what such a society truly is are branded and brushed aside as deviants who are never satisfied with what they already have. Oh, that super small group of protesters yelling about unfair elections? Don't pay attention to those people, they're just breaking the peace and complaining about nothing. You're in a democracy, remember?
Congratulations.
You're in a democracy.
Please do not resist.
New ideas and fair criticisms are underpinnings of any liberal society. Liberal democracy itself was once a very new idea. Just think about some ideas that were once new themselves.
Universal enfranchisement? Votes for women?
To that end, when such fair criticisms and new ideas are dismissed as irrelevant and harmful, it's essentially a rejection of liberalism. Now, a quick disclaimer. It should be noted that all sides of the political spectrum have engaged in some form of illiberal behavior. Specifically, there exist criticisms about how cancel culture and social justice from the extreme elements of the left have, to a degree, shredded the ability to conduct honest dialogue, air out disagreements, and build consensus, which are all components of a liberal society. And while these criticisms hold some weight in our current political climate, I would argue that the motivations of social justice are not evil in nature, but they merely reflect the desire for societal recognition from groups that have been historically marginalized and discriminated against. That being said, I would argue with certainty that the motivations of the right wing in this matter are far more dangerous in the long term. Okay, back to the video. A recent study by a team of 4 Canadian psychologists explored how Americans process new ideas and information, along with their inclination to modify their views based on said ideas and information. Their findings showed some pretty interesting things. For starters, it showed that individuals identifying as politically right-leaning had a relatively higher level of disagreement with statements like, "a person should always consider new possibilities," and had relatively higher levels of agreement with statements like, "one should disregard evidence that conflicts with your established beliefs." When it comes to right-wing leaders and figureheads, the strategy of branding fair criticisms and new ideas like this is part of a gradual effort to conflate liberalism with the unsavory elements of leftist politics. This is why the phrase "owning the libs" even exists. You know what liberalism means, and you can see why this is absolutely ridiculous. This effort, at its core, is a power play, like anything else in politics, a conditioning mechanism to get ordinary people to somehow be okay and even excited about the consolidation of political power for certain types of people and the teardown of rights for everybody else, all for the sake of developing a base. It started with highlighting how cringe social justice warriors can be, and ends with convincing citizens that addressing police brutality and expanding voting rights are somehow bad things for a democracy. It's one thing when an authoritarian state forcefully disseminates misinformation, but to succeed at fundamentally warping the way citizens think and process new information, all the while convincing them that they are still free, is a whole other level. Spawning a culture war and ruining individuals' ability to critically think like this ultimately makes it harder, and in some cases deadly, to engage in any kind of meaningful dialogue about things like democracy, corruption, and elections. Because the moment you do, you are either branded as a social justice warrior libtard or jailed, depending on which country you're in. So what's the big deal? How is this any different from all the other problems that we have in politics today? In the next couple of minutes, I'm going to try to explore 3 possible avenues where I think illiberal thinking is already having a major real-world effect: the Russian invasion of Ukraine, voting rights in the United States, and climate change. Recently, Russia decided to wreck the order that has mostly maintained peace and freedom in Europe for the first extended period of time in its history. Russia did this by beginning the invasion of Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is a country with a history of loudly rejecting the deterioration of liberalism, starting with its independence in 1991, to the 2004 Orange Revolution against electoral fraud, to the 2014 Maidan Revolution to topple an utterly corrupt administration, to the present situation of literally having to defend itself from invasion. Now, support for Russia has been obviously sparse on all sides, but that doesn't stop certain figures in Western society from being coy about their real attitudes towards the situation. Firstly, there has always been a level of fascination that has existed for Putin within liberal nations even before this conflict. Some people are drawn to his charismatic, strong style of leadership. Some elements of the American right wing see Putin and other illiberal strongmen as key players on their side in the culture war. These are nations with horrific records in human rights, political freedom, and free speech. But hey, at least they're owning the libs.
Why do I hate Putin so much? Has Putin ever called me a racist? Has he threatened to get me fired for disagreeing with him? Has he shipped every middle-class job in my town to Russia? Did he manufacture a worldwide pandemic that wrecked my business and kept me indoors for 2 years? Is he teaching my children to embrace racial discrimination? Is he making fentanyl? Is he trying to snuff out Christianity? Does he eat dogs? These are fair questions, and the answer to all of them is no.
The reason that Putin ain't woke, he is anti-woke.
The Russians, people still know which bathroom to use.
They know how many genders are there in Russia?
2.
Okay.
The reason this is alarming is because not every war is a culture war. Sometimes it's actually just war. And when people in a liberal democracy see a leader like Putin wantonly blitz into a country that has proven time and time again that it wants liberal democracy above all else, and all they can muster up, at best, is a meek acknowledgement that Russia started it, and at worst, conspiracy theories about Satanism that should absolutely raise red flags. How long until the erosion of liberalism at home becomes a non-issue, or even justified by some conspiracy theory? Some would argue that such things are already happening. A good example of this would be the dialogue surrounding voting rights and elections in general in the United States. Enfranchisement is central to liberalism. It is how consent of the governed is implemented. To that end, such consent can only truly be attained when everyone in a society has the same access and ability to vote. The government must represent everyone. If you look at the history of the United States, there were occasional landmark moments where the word everyone took new meaning. First, it meant white men who owned property. Then it meant white men. Then it meant men. Then, with the 19th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it actually meant everyone. However, what plays out in practice is usually a little bit different than what's on paper. This topic alone could be a separate video, but I will go over a couple of examples I think really highlight how some leaders in the United States sometimes behave as if they don't even want a liberal democracy. Now, one of the biggest criticisms over the renewed push for voting rights reform is the idea that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 pretty much covered everything, and that anything beyond that must be unnecessary. And on some level that might make sense, but it makes no sense when you take into account a landmark court case from 2013. In 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States deliberated on Shelby County versus Holder. The case focused on some key provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, specifically the concept of something called federal pre-clearance. Now, federal pre-clearance is a process where certain states have to run changes to their voting laws by the federal government prior to implementation. This was originally implemented because of the way certain states would conduct elections when left to their own devices. This is textbook federalism. However, 4 decades later, the Supreme Court ultimately decided in a 5-4 decision that pre-clearance was no longer necessary, since it was based on data and issues from the 1960s. This meant it became open season for some jurisdictions to start tweaking voting procedures. Within 2 hours of the ruling, the Attorney General of Texas tweeted the reinstitution of stricter photo ID laws that were previously blocked under pre-clearance by a federal court. In no time, states like Texas and North Carolina all jumped to implement cutbacks in same-day voter registration, early voting, out-of-precinct voting, and more. And it should be noted that all of these cutbacks were previously considered intentionally discriminatory under the Voting Rights Act prior to Shelby County versus Holder. And in the 5 years following the ruling, nearly 900 polling sites across the country, many of which were in neighborhoods with large minority populations, were closed for cost-cutting measures. If these poll closings were truly just about cutting costs, and certain leaders were still truly about ensuring equal access to the vote, they would probably just support mail-in voting, right? Right? There are is already an alarming avalanche of evidence to suggest that we humans are on a collision course with our own planet. Climate change, as you may or may not know, at its current rate is set to have harmful effects on the global way of life. Increased frequency and intensity of storms, wildfires, and droughts, to name a few. However, aside from these actual physical effects, people should be equally concerned about what these changes will mean for our systems of governance. As the last couple of years have shown us, natural events are clearly capable of significantly changing the norms we are familiar with and take for granted. In just a matter of a couple of years, the entire global supply chain that has enabled unfettered economic growth for the past 70 years is being called into question, as nations including the United States are beginning to reindustrialize and make more things in-house. Not to mention the fact that COVID-19 rekindled the age-old debate between freedom and order to an incandescent level in Western democracies.
Well, in this case, snitches get rewards.
The thing is, we don't even know whether liberal democracy can survive the upheaval, migration, and ideological shifts that may occur due to climate change, but we know that it has to. At a time where common ground on basic liberal ideas might be our only hope in ensuring democracy survives in the long term, we instead see politicians and citizens behave the way they do. A common argument is that the rhetoric of politicians does not actually represent their true beliefs, and that it is all for the purpose of gaining fame or notoriety, depending on how desperate they are. However, as Rachel Dawes said,
"It's not who you are underneath. It's what you do that defines you."
It might be shocking to hear, but when you have outsized influence, the words you say can quite literally change the way people think. Rhetoric, by definition, is meant to be persuasive. To sum up, endorsements and the practice of illiberal tactics lead to a destruction of the system of self-determination, problem-solving, and democracy that our species only recently established. To that end, it's important to recognize that we are still only 350 or so years into disrupting the status quo. Due to the major emphasis on American or Western history in our education system, it can sometimes seem like liberal thought and democracy as concepts have been around for as long as it matters. But you know this is false. Humans have pretty much been tearing stuff up on this planet for thousands of years, the majority of which have involved barbarous rulers, divine rights to rule, monarchies, and brutalities where the only word in our modern vocabulary that does them some justice is genocide. The construction of liberal democracy is quite literally the miracle of our species. It represents the recognition of our best virtues and the fears of our worst. For this reason, when we see people in liberal democracies whine about, demean, and attack the very principles of liberalism, we must recognize that they unfortunately have history on their side. To combat this regression to the mean, I think it's helpful to understand and uplift the types of thinking that separated us from that mean, and more urgently, be vigilant about the types of thinking that could lead us back there. As humans, we face lots of threats. There's the constant reality of violence, there's crime, there's sickness, and of course, there's the risk of our own planet turning on us as we continue to basically hotbox the atmosphere. But I would also contend that all these threats can at the very least be seen. They can be tracked, measured, and hopefully responded to. But illiberalism is insidious. It moves quietly and spreads quickly. It's a form of thought that can be disguised behind many political ideologies and cultural realities. It ultimately inhibits our ability to solve problems, maintain a democracy, and most importantly, exercise free will.